The Last of Us finally premiered on HBO and HBO Max, and that begs the question, is it the best video game adaptation of all time? And what does that actually even mean? We're talking all that and more on the Chatter After Daily. Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Welcome to the Chatter After Daily, the show where we chat, argue, and wax poetic about the topics in movies, video games, TV, pretty much anything in pop culture. It's not a live stream today. It's MLK Day, so we've got a pre-recorded video for you. Joining me is Christian from Film Optics. Christian, we were talking because we just did our Last of Us conversation for your podcast, which is, folks, you got to check that out. We're going to link that in the description for you. We were talking and the conversation kind of turned to video game adaptations and what does that even mean, right? Because there's been a lot of buzz about Tlu being the greatest video game adaptation, and it kind of feels like they're shading some of the great things we've gotten over the last 5 years. Like, first off, welcome to the show. And what are your thoughts on all that?
Thank you so much for having me on. Like I said, again, it's scratching an inch of a topic that I've been dying to talk about because we keep seeing this, especially on Twitter, when it comes to the video game adaptations, and it's such a delicate thing because I think we first have to ask ourselves, what is the definition of an adaptation when it comes to adapting one property or one media to another? And like I've seen a few different outlets saying, like you said, The Last of Us is like the best adaptation ever. And I was like, well, I commented on someone's Twitter today. I'm not going to say whose, but I was like, well, I think you mean live action because, like right. Mike said, we've had these fantastic adaptations within these past 5 years, whether it be Sonic the Hedgehog 1 or 2, or Arcane, or Cyberpunk Edge Runners, or Castlevania even. And it's like, I mean, they're adapted. They're not necessarily focusing on the story, but I think it depends on the property itself. Because like for League of Legends, there's story within League of Legends where you have to kind of like go out of your way to find the background of each hero.
Right.
But for Arcane, it's like they were able to adapt, Arcane or League of Legends into a TV show and give us more insight of who these characters are and essentially creating like a whole new world when it comes to adaptations. But I'm excited to talk about it today. It's just it's a fine line, and I don't know if people are necessarily right or wrong, and I don't think we're going to be talking about, X, right, Y, and Z, this person's wrong, but it's more of just figuring out what does the word adaptation mean when it comes to video games, and what does it mean when it comes to like even like book series like Game of Thrones, because there's a lot of things that go off book, but it's still an adaptation. So it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. It's fascinating because you think of something like we're going to go to Marvel, for example, right? We have Captain America Civil War, which is taking the name of a very iconic Marvel story of Civil War. And the movie does have certain elements that carry over, right? You've got the Accords, you've got the Superhuman Registration Act, you've got the same similarities and parallels, Team Iron Man versus Team Cap. Those are all elements from that storyline. But one thing that I think is very important to notice is that every Marvel movie starts off in the opening credits, based on Marvel Comics, because they're taking so many creative liberties. So many different characters are introduced. So many different characters are taking part in that story that weren't in the original. And it's all jumbled in a way that is almost not even recognizable to what Civil War, the comic book, is. Even though the themes are still there, like it's still in the DNA of that film. I don't would we consider that an adaptation, or would we just say this is inspired by Civil War? And I think that's where the fine line comes, right? Is the verbiage and the language, understanding what that actually means, Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So for Civil War, it is, first and foremost, just want to say it's been a very long time since I've read any kind of comic. It was mainly like mostly Spider-Man comics when I was younger. I didn't have a lot of them, but I had I was able to like rent them from like the library, but it was really just like random issues. So I wasn't able to necessarily follow along with like a specific um writer's, storyline.
Right.
But when it comes to Civil War, hmm, I guess you could say it's an adaptation because you are taking that Civil War story from the comics and adapting it for film. But at the same time, it's like so many, like you said, Mike, so many things are skewed, and they take so many liberties and suspense of disbelief. Like in the Last of Us series, there's no spores in the series, but it is in the games. But it's but they're using the hive mind situation for the series, so it's kind of like a scapegoat for that. But for
Right.
Civil War, I guess it would be an adaptation, but it's also based on Marvel Comics at the same time. But I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer because it's obviously, it's based on Marvel Comics. So it is taking those characters from the comics, putting them on screen, but Disney also owns it. So I guess why would they feel the need to say based by Marvel Comics? Like if it was, Craig Mazin who is running the Last of Us series, that
Yeah.
is, he's clearly stating, hey, this is not my property. I do not own this. I'm adapting this video game for television. But Disney owns Marvel. So would they really need to put based by Marvel Comics? What I don't know, but it is something that they bought, so it is not technically their
Right. They don't make shorts say based on Mickey Mouse, right? It's
right.
I think that's why the verbiage is very important. I'm a big words guy, because I write for a living. So like I pay attention to like the small details and intricacies of how that works. So we're just gonna go to the dictionary. Maybe that'll make it a little easier.
Maybe, yeah.
Base or based means have as the foundation for something, use as a point for which something can develop. For example, this film is based on a novel by Pat Conroy. And I think that goes back to why they do that, right? So Disney is just saying this is based on Marvel Comics. Like the foundation of this film is Marvel. Even if the story is not the Civil War or not the Infinity Gauntlet story right? Because when you go to Avengers Infinity War, right, it's very much inspired by the Infinity Gauntlet comic from the 80s. But in that story, Thanos is in love with Death. Like, Death is a physical person that he is simping for. And he says, I will destroy half the universe for you. That's where the snap happens. That is so stupid on film. It's funny in comics. I don't know if you can make that work in the movie. So therefore, I think that's where, again, the verbiage changes because, yeah, it's developed from that central theme of Thanos snapping his fingers, but the movie, the storyline itself is vastly different. Whereas the definition of adaptation is the action or process of adapting or being adapted. For example, a movie, television series, drama, or stage play that was adapted by a written work. And it's essentially saying, you're taking that story and bringing it to life on screen. And I think that's where The Last of Us and Arcane kind of differ, at least for me. Whereas Arcane, like you were saying earlier, League of Legends is a vastly different story compared to what Arcane is. Like you said, it's very hard to even get the story beats because it's kind of hidden throughout the game, which you have to
Yeah.
discover on your own. And Arcane isn't necessarily adapting those story beats either. It's really just taking those characters and doing its own thing with it. So I think I would say Arcane is probably based on League of Legends, and The Last of Us is adapting The Last of Us. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me for sure.
Okay.
No, yeah, it really does because I guess prior to us talking, I was like, well, I would think that adaptation is adaptation, like no matter how you slice it. But when you put it
Right.
that way, like it is like even though Arcane still, the series is an adaptation, you are adapting the game, which a lot of the backstory, it's really from the characters themselves, but it is like a new world.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like Arcane is based off of it. I feel like yes. Sorry, I'm like,
You're good.
well, like because what you said is like okay, like what he said makes total sense, and now I'm like rethinking everything in my brain. Where I'm like, okay, now I'm seeing everything differently. So yeah, so word for word, bar for bar. If you're talking about the Last of Us adaptation, because it is essentially ripping that story and putting it on screen, adding a few, extra story beats, additional details and whatnot, because, every things have to be adapted a specific way for film or television.
Right.
But for Arcane or even Cyberpunk Edge Runners, I'm not well, for Edge Runners, yeah, I would say it's based on the video game. It is a adaptation in a way, but it's like a different adaptation. But I
Yeah.
would say it is more like it is based off of the video game, but we're creating our own story. We're creating our own characters for this. But that's where Arcane and Cyberpunk differ, because for Arcane, all those characters, those are all heroes, or at least the backstory is what we're getting of all these heroes. Some of them we know who they are with Jinx, but for other characters in Cyberpunk Edge Runners, I believe a lot of those were just created for that specific show. I think so. Yeah. So I guess based on an adaptation in the sense of video games is different, because when you're adapting like a book like Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, it has to be the story itself, because you can't change too much from the source material. Otherwise, it's not okay. Yeah, I got you. Otherwise, it's not a true.
It's not a true adaptation. Yeah. So
sorry, you guys just went through my brain. I'm like, oh yeah, so this means this, and I'm like, I see what he's saying.
Yeah. So that brings us back to video games, right? And I think that's why you get tweets like that saying Last of Us is the best adaptation, because Sonic, by this definition, is an adaptation. It's a film influenced, inspired, and based on the character Sonic the Hedgehog, And so that brings us to a different question. I wanted to throw this at you. Should video games start being more one-to-one adaptations? Like, should the God of War series that's going to come to Amazon just be what the God of War franchise is, or should it be based on, and they take the idea of Kratos and Atreus and do their own thing with it?
Oh no.
If
because that also gets into like the whole anime thing is one of the anime adaptations, because as we unfortunately saw the unraveling of Cowboy Bebop.
Oof, good point.
And it's like I don't want to say that no, Kratos shouldn't, be able, like, hey, I have an idea for Kratos and Atreus, and I want to roll with it a different way. But I feel like for The Last of Us, like from what we've seen so far, I think sticking closely to the source material, especially for story-driven games, like heavily story-driven games, I think it is, I guess, safer, but also the better route to stick with the same story. But, if there are things that the showrunner wants to improve upon, they can do that. Because we saw with Halo, I know a lot of the Halo series on Paramount Plus, everyone was so up in arms. And, oh, Master Chief took off his helmet. Master Chief is having sex. And I was like, I mean, but like that is adapted for television and for, for film. So it's like you have to kind of just take liberties. It's like, well, you can't just expect like Master Chief to just be like the super stone cold guy who just always comes in and like saves the day. Like, I do want to see a different side to Master Chief. I do want to see what's kind of underneath the helmet. But that show for Halo, it's not connected to the games at all.
Right.
So I guess to answer your question, I would say for story-driven games, they should probably stick more towards the source material, because if not, unfortunately, you do get things like Halo. As much as I did enjoy it for it being different, it opens up a whole new can of worms, but at the same time it sucks because you are kind of limiting that showrunner to doing certain things.
Yeah.
Where so I don't know what do you think?
I think it's honestly, this may sound like a cop out. I think it's a case by case basis. Like
Fair enough.
you mentioned anime, and that's why you went to the negative aspect of if you don't do it, you end up with something like Cowboy Bebop, right? But I'm also looking at it as just how anime functions, right? Look at My Hero Academia, a show both of us love. That is one-to-one just about adapted from the My Hero Academia manga.
Yeah.
The art in the manga is a tad better. Horikoshi's a fantastic artist. But aside from that, it's one-to-one adaptation of what's going on in that book. And so on one hand, that allows people like us who don't really read manga to discover these shows and these stories in a new way. And one thing that we were even saying on the Film Optics review of Tilu's first episode is that it's great that a new audience can discover this story. For us, it's 10 years old and we're revisiting these characters. But for them, they're being introduced to Joe, Ellie, Sarah, Tess, all for the first time. And it's affecting them in a way that it did us when we first played the game. So I think doing a one-to-one adaptation for The Last of Us, it works because they are reaching that new audience. And so I feel like in God of War's case, I don't know, because like a lot of Kratos's motivations and character come from those first 3 games that I have not played. So now the question is, I know, right? Gasp. The question is, do you adapt all of the entire God of War saga, and you don't even introduce Atreus until season 3 or 4?
I think so. Because you have to, because God of War 2018 is a continuation of God of War 3. And with Ragnarok, Kratos makes a lot of references to the previous games, like reassuring people that all these games are connected.
Right.
And it makes for a more impactful story because you hear about, the things that was done wrong to Kratos when he first started out his journey, what happens to his children, his mother, his brother. And I think you would have to start from the very beginning. I think you might be doing maybe a little bit disservice by just starting off with like, okay, well, let's do 2018 because, Norse mythology is in right now. We have like the Northmen that came out, Robert Eggers. We have this, we have the Viking show. I think that's already done. I can't remember.
Thor, just in general.
So but I think if they decided to go with Norse mythology going through, it's you had to have all the you have to make sure to include all the exposition from the first 3 games and sprinkle it throughout God of War, 2018 God of War Ragnarok. But those are just, that's the whole Norse mythology or saga right there, because they're not doing 3 games. They cut it down to 2. Right. But that's tough. I mean, on one hand, I would love to see Kratos at the very beginning of his journey because, I mean, it's supposed to be the Blaze of Chaos. So it's like either you do heavy exposition of Kratos' past within God of War 2018 for the Amazon series. And then there's also the Horizon series as well. But for God of War, it's like, you either have to sprinkle that throughout the series or you have to start from like the very beginning. But knowing Hollywood, they just want to get to the good stuff.
Right.
But there's a lot of good stuff within the first 3 games. But the more recent good stuff, I think they would probably go that route of having flashbacks of Kratos' past. This is kind of the way you have to do it.
And I'm glad you mentioned Horizon 2, right? And I think that's why I feel like it's a case-by-case basis, because look at the Mario Brothers movie that's coming out, not the old one. The new animated movie from Illumination that's coming out, right? That there's nothing to adapt from Mario. Like,
it doesn't really have a story.
It doesn't have a story. And that's why
Yeah.
With modern games, specifically PlayStation first-party titles, it probably makes sense to say, hey, this would be a great story to adapt for The Last of Us or Uncharted, right? Because the Uncharted games are so much fun and the story beats are actually really good, especially as you get further down the line in that series. But then you have something like Horizon, right? Where Horizon's story is like the least beloved out of all of the PlayStation modern titles. And like, I love Horizon. I don't play it for the story. I play it because I love the
The
world
gameplay.
and the
Yeah.
gameplay and all that stuff. So it's like, that might be one where it's like, yeah, you just do the little based on a PlayStation video game at the bottom of the title card, and then you
Yeah.
just do your own thing. Like, still keep the same beats for Aloy, but make her a bit more interesting, make those supporting characters.
Please make her more interesting, because she is very one note in those games.
Yeah, she is. And
there's
again,
nothing
that's
wrong with it. It's just she never changes. Everyone around her changes.
right.
It's like the Forrest Gump effect. I mean, it works with Forrest Gump, because who doesn't love Forrest Gump? But
Yeah.
it's like, hey, Aloy, you know, she's tried and true all the way through. She's the Luke Skywalker of this video game franchise, where it's like, you know, she's doing good for goodness' sake, like, because it is the right thing to do. Like,
Right.
and there is no other motive. But yeah, also there's Gran Turismo coming out.
Very true.
I was like, what? Oh, how is this? What? And then there's also, oh my gosh, there was something else that was coming out. Well, you already mentioned Uncharted. Oh yeah, Mario, what you had mentioned before. So yeah, for Mario, it's like, I mean, every game is so different. Like, it's just, oh, you have to go save Princess Peach from Bowser or from Baby Bowser, and
right.
that's kind of it. I feel like, yeah, I think it would be more of a case by case situation. Unfortunately, like, the Warcraft movie did not do very well. Tomb Raider, depends on who you ask. I think they're fun, entertaining movies all around. But yeah, I think it depends on what the story is altogether. Like, if they did like Mass Effect, like, that's still might be a little bit different, because you're giving the player choices in those games that affects the outcome of the next game, and so on and so forth. But yeah, for Horizon, I'm curious to see how that works. For God of War, I could see them kind of just going the same route as The Last of Us. But also, I wanted to ask you, did you watch the Ratchet and Clank movie? The movie that was
the one that's pretty much just cutscenes from the game?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because that's another thing where it's like, I don't. Yeah, it was like a movie that was based on the first game. That it was some weird Inception thing, and
yeah,
I was like, okay, so what about like even animated? Because that would be PlayStation's most recent animated adaptation, because I would say that is more of a faithful adaptation of at least the first game of Ratchet and Clank. But it's, I don't know, my head's spinning.
I think this is why The Last of Us is so impressive, because we can firmly say without a shadow of a doubt that this game and this show are telling the exact same story. Yeah, there are different, elements and nuances. That this isn't a spoiler cast of The Last of Us. We're not going to ruin, those for you here. But there are moments that are different from the game. And I feel like, honestly, for me, you've got to be at least a 60-40 split, right? If the 60% of the game and the story is still in there, you are a faithful adaptation. And I think that's all it comes down to. Because look at another example. Look at, I know I'm using a lot of superhero movies, but
no, you're fine. I mean, it's what's new right now,
Right.
So
look at Batman Begins. Batman Begins.
Love it.
Fantastic movie that is heavily influenced by The Long Halloween. Have you seen The Long Halloween, at least the animated movie?
The animated, I have, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, the themes of Gordon and Batman, the Dark Knight too, right? Them working together, having to stop the Joker and the Dark Knight. All those themes are like weaving throughout Nolan's trilogy of The Long Halloween, but it's not The Long Halloween at all. There's no holiday killer, there's no Poison Ivy. We don't see Two-Face's wife be a major role in that story. And so you can say it's inspired by The Long Halloween, but it's still an original Batman story. And I just think that's where a lot of these come into play. Like Uncharted is very much influenced by the Uncharted games, even though it doesn't look like it sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of sequences where it's like Tom Holland's falling out of a plane.
Right from the game. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like, even though that's not a specific moment in the game in particular, you can tell that is still the DNA of what an Uncharted action sequence would look like.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel about Arcane. That's how I feel about Castlevania. It's like, you guys are great for what you are, but if we're going off of taking a game, putting it on screen, I think that's what The Last of Us is doing.
Yeah. For Arcane, I feel like for Arcane, it is a special situation because, I mean, that is a MOBA. So, like, it's literally that entire game is about gameplay. Like, there's no story mode in Arcane. So I feel like the only way they were able to adapt it is by creating what they have.
Yeah.
Because but for Cyberpunk, I don't know. I mean, then you have Mortal Kombat for live action as well. Sonic is see, now I'm like, is that an adaptation or is that just,
I mean, we're in a new city called Green Hills, which is very much a nod to the stage Green Hill Zone. So I would say it's inspired by the games, because when you really think about it, Sonic is palling around with a Donut Lord for 2 movies, and then we get introduced to Miles and Knuckles in the sequel. And again, I want to make it clear, this is not shade to any of these properties. This just shows Sonic, much like Mario, didn't have a lot of story in those original games until we get to go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I mean, I think this is probably the ultimate example of any video game being adapted to a series. Pokemon. Yeah. Is that just, based on by the video game? Or, because, I mean, Pokemon is a story-driven game. Because
I have never played Pokemon, so only you can come up with that decision.
I can't speak for all of the Pokemon fans out there.
No, you have been knighted. You are the representative of the entire Pokemon fandom.
Well, if we're going that route, we need to, go back to the drawing board. These new games are great, but let's get that performance up there. But I mean, I've heard they're great. Actually, I haven't played the new ones. I don't have a Switch anymore, RIP. But I know it's just dark days over here. But for Pokemon, I would say, at least for the very beginning, for us oldies out there, Kanto region, I would say the first few seasons, I mean, it is following, your Ash is going through collecting on the 8 gym badges, and Team Rocket is in there. So I would say, at least for the start of Pokemon, it is a faithful adaptation. I wouldn't say it's just based on, because, you start in Pallet Town. Especially with Pokemon Yellow, which is more so tailored to the special version of Red and Blue, which is more tailored to Ash's journey, because you do get a Pikachu during the beginning of Pokemon Yellow, and you do have the ability to obtain Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur, and you can find a Pidgeotto in Viridian Forest, and which is I would say, at least starting off, or at least for the most, I would say it's more of an adaptation. I wouldn't say it leans on based on a video game, but I think it's the ultimate comparison, because it really is, for as far as I've been on this earth, it's like or as far as I've been alive, it's like the original video game to TV show adaptation, because Pokemon exploded. Now there's a card game. It's arguably, I think it is the world's biggest franchise, if I'm not mistaken.
For video games, at least, but it's definitely one of the world's biggest franchises in general, too.
Like, it just blew up. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, where it's just everything was Pokemon. Everything. And it's just, these franchises, whether we like it or not, they, unfortunately, even for The Last of Us, it's no longer just a video game franchise. Like, it's no longer just a video game. It is a franchise, like, itself. Like, there's comics out there as well. Right. So I guess it's just, if you would ask me maybe a year or two ago, I would not have liked video game adaptations. But now I'm like, Yeah.
Yeah, and
Let people enjoy things.
yeah, but that's why I think this is a good conversation to have, right? Because the this all started from the idea of based on versus adapted from.
Right.
And I think having that mix of both is good, right? Because Arcane can exist and be its own thing. You don't have to have ever played the League of Legends games, but
Yeah.
even if you have, you can just go in and not know what to expect or what's going to happen. Whereas
Oh
The
yeah.
Last of Us, we know what's going to happen for the most part, and the fun is seeing the twists and turns they may throw in there, the curveballs they may give
Mhm.
us. And so I think both experiences are valid, but to get up in arms about the verbiage people use, like Arcane is the based animated series based on a video game. The Last of Us is the best live action series adapting a video game. It's like, just understand that there is different verbiage for those things, and we
Mhm.
can coexist and enjoy all of the things
Yeah.
without getting up in arms. you
That's
know,
true. Yeah.
it, it
I think that's a great way to put it. Sorry, continue.
No, I was just gonna add, The Last of Us is a franchise that is near and dear to a lot of people and also hated by a lot of people. So I feel like there's just gonna be discourse surrounding it, regardless
Oh
whether it's
yeah.
warranted or not. So I'm glad we were able to have this conversation, and
Yeah.
you know,
It's true. I mean, there's it's something with The Last of Us where like it's a blessing and a curse
yeah,
because the remake came out. Like I was very opinionated about the price of a $70 remake of a game that most
rightfully so.
people, yeah, and it's like it's oh man, when I look back at it, and if the fact that Naughty Dog had to keep pumping out these videos explaining everything, and I was just more on the side of this should be $50. This should be a no brainer for anyone.
Yeah,
But much like the show that is like for all intents and purposes that is made for people who don't own a PlayStation. It's made for newcomers to the series, but for me, when it came to, people are kind of spending the same thing for the remake. And I was like, I mean, it is, but it isn't because, your day one people are going to be those hardcore fans. Like I bought it day one because I love this game. I love this universe. It's probably my favorite video game franchise, or one of them at least. It's definitely up there, but
yeah.
it's probably my favorite video game story that I've ever experienced out of everything that I've ever played because it's not like The Witcher. Oh, there's all these different endings. Like it is very cinematic, and that is what really draws people to it. But yeah, for some reason, like The Last of Us, anything like part two, it's like first it just triggers so many people. And I'm like, it's so whether it's the price of the remake or what happened in The Last of Us Part Two, and then every single announcement that gets The Last of Us, it seems like just gets leaks. It's like they're
Yes,
cursed. And I don't know what it is, but I don't know. But
I know what
overall,
it is. It's one of the most beloved video games of all time that just automatically attracts hate. Like there's so many people who hate on Batman,
yeah.
and it's like it's because Batman's the top dude, right? Like
Yeah.
they always come for Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, and The Last of Us. That's what ends up happening. And it just is what it
Gatekeeping
is.
happens, and I think sometimes it's indirect because it's happened with me before.
Yeah.
And it's not that I did it purposely. It was just I think some of us care about these properties so much that like we want to keep it as pure as it can be without, it being like muddled, but it's, I mean, it is what it is now. Like I'm, I have a different view on it, but like that was like years ago. But sometimes I feel like people just care too much that they indirectly gatekeep.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're being, like a doo-doo head or whatever about it, if you're being a dick about it, you're being a dick about it. But it's
There was someone on social media last night after the premiere of The Last of Us, and they were just going and spoiling new watchers. They were just like, hey, do you know what happens in The
Wow.
Last of Us 2? And
You know what? They did that for the House of the Dragon. No one did that for Game of Thrones, by the way. Like the original Game of Thrones series. Everyone was very respectful, but readers were very respectful when it came to spoilers. But for the House of the Dragon, they were just like flying.
Yeah, because haters were bred after the ending of Game of Thrones. And that's my point. Like, somebody's going and tagging people, spoiling The Last of Us Part 2 because they feel like, well, I'm sparing them because Part 2 sucks. And so they should know not to get invested in this show.
Okay, Thanos.
And I'm just like, it's like, okay, all right, whatever. Guys, let people enjoy things.
Yes.
And if you don't enjoy something, that's okay. Just let people enjoy what they like, and you just move on to the next thing you actually like.
Yeah, it doesn't affect you at all. Like Neil Druckmann is very excited about this, clearly. And I was like, I mean, I'm excited about it. I mean, I just can't believe we're finally here when it comes to like, you know, the Last of Us adaptation. Altogether, because it feels like we've been talking about this for the past 10 years when really it's only been like the past like 2 or 3. But you know, we hear about these projects and then they're kind of quiet for a while, and then we wonder if they're still coming out, and then it's like, oh, it's still here. So I think I'm still in that like honeymoon phase, or just like, you know, I can't believe it's like actually here. But I'm excited for, you know, like we said, like for whatever adaptation, it's usually made for the more casual audience who doesn't have access. Where it's like, oh, you know, people were able to experience the story in video games. And like, I mean, The Last of Us is like, it is still a video game franchise. It's just, it's grown into something bigger, but like its core will always be a video game franchise. Same thing with Cyberpunk, Arcane, Pokemon. Like that is, without that, there is no show like whatsoever. So it is a, I feel like it's an Achilles heel sometimes, but like you said, it's case by case basis. I think I would agree with you for that for video games, because you can't treat every video game the same, because that is how you get bad adaptations. Same thing with live action anime.
But that's the thing. They're not all the same, right? Because like we just laid out, Super Mario Brothers and The Last of Us are not the same whatsoever.
No.
At all. And so it's like it'd be very ignorant of you to approach them that same way, which is why, again, being adults or being very smart kids, I don't know how old you are watching this video, understanding that Arcane is a masterpiece of a series. It's also not one-to-one what League of Legends is, and that's okay. Whereas The Last of Us is looking to be a masterpiece of a series. And it is adapting the things almost one for one, word for word, bar for bar, as we constantly say. It's like there's a video on the channel, guys, that is literally side-by-side comparisons of the Last of Us game and the Last of Us show. Check that out, because it's the same.
It literally, and like they may paraphrase a few small lines between, but like it again, it's just two different mediums. You know, you have the empathy of control with video games, and then with film and TV, like you have no choice but to just watch passively what's happening on the screen. You do the same thing in video games, but you have a closer connection to the characters, which I think, I guess, I mean, I don't know if I can put one medium over the other, but it just makes for a different experience.
1000%. The intimacy of being in that situation, right? Like you are connected, especially in The Last of Us, you're connected to Joel and Ellie in a way that I just can't with the show. And that's not even a knock on the show. It's just that's how power of video games.
It really is. Because I mean, you know, you go through these emotional moments with these characters. You know, in the video game, like you do get to play as Ellie during some parts, and so that really just adds it even more. Because you know, when you're playing through the first game, you're like, oh, you know, they're going on this journey. It's like, oh, am I just gonna play Joel the entire time? And then at some point during the game, you switch over to Ellie. It's like, oh, that's awesome. You know, like obviously you've been Joel, like you are her protector, but you also get to spend some alone time with her. So I think that's it's just what video games are able to do. And like I said, it's different. It's the power of video games when it comes to that. It's just how it is, and controller in hand, and away you go.
Away you go, guys. The journey is just starting with The Last of Us. Make sure you check out Film Optics. I know we just did a review of The Last of Us episode 1. Again, linked in the description. Christian, it's been a blast having you here, man. You got anything else you want to tell the people about before we go?
Oh boy. Well, thank you again for having me on for this philosophical discussion. Well, like it really is, because it's like I need to like sit down and think, and I'm like, I need to talk about this with somebody and like get all my thoughts out. And it's like, oh, this is what this is. But no, yeah, you can follow us. We are on we're an audio only podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all that jazz. You can of course look forward to our episode 1 review, which Mike joined us for, The Last of Us HBO series. We'll be covering that weekly. You can also look forward to our Missing review. I think we're going to be covering that as well as our That 90s Show spoiler-free review that I was joined with Amanda, aka AMX India Reviews, on that as well. But yeah, you can find our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, like I said before. But thank you so much for having me on. And you can follow us on Twitter at Film Optics, like it says down there, on Twitter and Instagram as well. But this has been a blast.
Yeah. That's what I love about the YouTube space, where we don't need a whole dedicated episode to a show or a movie. We can just have a topic we want to talk about and jump in. That's why I love the new series, The Cheddar After Daily here. Yeah, it's been a blast having you here, man. Definitely going to link the channel and everything. The podcast, sorry, YouTube brain. Definitely going to link the podcast in the description. And guys, if you enjoyed this conversation, if you enjoyed The Last of Us, make sure you like and subscribe, because we are talking T-Lou every Tuesday. I'm calling them T-Lou Tuesdays now.
I like that.
Beyond the Clickers, 8:30 Eastern. Me, Brett, Brandon, breaking down every single episode. We've got a pilot to talk about tomorrow, so make sure you're there.
Yeah, that's a great name for a podcast, because I think the official The Last of Us podcast is just called The Last of Us Podcast.
Yes, it
Same
is.
thing with House of the Dragon. They have their own companion podcast, which I still need to listen to The Last of Us one, because I know they just started that. But yeah, Beyond the Clickers, that is a great name. Everyone go check it out. I watched the preview to the first episode, so I'm very excited to check out your guys' journey on that.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. I can't wait to see, because we don't talk until we hit record or hit go live. I can't wait to see what Brett and Brandon actually thought of this episode. We'll see how that goes. But until next time, guys, peace.
Peace.